Good morning, Bob. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Chris.
No, I really want to talk about leadership because I think there's a number of points I want to try and cover during this conversation. Firstly, how do we think leadership would change as a result of the pandemic? And then also touch on how do we enable young leaders to come breakthrough? Because I think that we know there's been a blockage over the last decade or so.
Fine. And I think my first comment, Chris, would be, sometimes in good times when the business is rolling along, you sometimes wonder almost what the leader is doing because business seems to come to the door, come what may, and everyone sort of pats themselves on the back thinking how clever they are. Hotels are full, restaurants are full, and life just rolls along and leadership looks extraordinarily difficult because the bottom line keeps growing. And that is fine, but it's at times like this when you're really up against it that you understand that the guy at the top really does matter, and leadership is the absolute critical factor, whether it's the guy at the top of a big organization or the guy trying to manage a small team in a local restaurant or coffee shop. So, never underestimate the importance of leadership, particularly in really difficult times.
Which leads to the obvious question, how do you think it's performed during this period?
I have actually been really quite disappointed in what I've seen in terms of visible leadership, because I think there are two things that I've been looking for. I've been looking for major companies and the leaders of major companies to recognize that they don't just have a responsibility for their own company, they also have a responsibility to the sector as well, to try and guide the sector through the difficulties that we are running through at the moment. And I've seen some, good individual examples, but I've been very disappointed in the main by the large corporates not showing leadership in the sector, and it's almost been left to individuals of the smaller private companies to exercise leadership both within their business and for the sector as a whole.
And why do you think that's the case? Can I ask? I agree.
I suspect it's about change of ownership of businesses in that, fortunately, when I started work, I worked for a very large company, Trust House 40 Gardner Merchant, where, all the hotels were owned by the company. Everyone understood who the ownership was, and it was run by people who owned the business. Whereas today, whether it's large restaurant groups, large hotel groups, even the contract caterers, the ownership in the main is with capital venture companies, bankers, etc., who I don't feel understand who are really connected to the hospitality business, so that the leaders are more in hoc, as it were, to the financiers than they are to the sector, their workforce, or their customers, which I've always taken the view in hospitality. It's this triumvirate that you always work with. You work with your staff, you work with your customers, as well as working for the owners and the shareholders.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. This is the argument, particularly coming out of the US, I've noticed a lot. The more companies have been owned by private investors, VCs, the less visible leadership's become.
Well, that is the point I'm making, and their first reaction whenever they get into difficulty is to protect the balance sheet and protect the bottom line in the very short term, and all the decisions they're making tend to be short term rather than taking the longer term view of the sector and their companies. And I know the experience I've had in recent years working with private family businesses. The senior management's whole thrust is always on how can they manage the business to leave it in good shape for the next generation. They take a generational view rather than what's in it in the next 12 months and can I maintain the bottom line and can I maintain my bonus. It's a cultural issue, and I think it hasn't served as well in hospitality in the last few years, this change of ownership of the sector.
That's an interesting one. I mean, one of the things that particularly worries me is that the age of leaders has actually naturally increased quite dramatically. So I think we talked a couple of days ago when you first came on board director, you were about 29 years old.
Yeah. Indeed, but I think that is a direct reflection on, as it were, this change of ownership that the capital venture companies, bankers, financiers have sort of gone for safety and experience, shall we say, and track record rather than backing flair, brains, intelligence, innovation, etc., which takes a little bit more of a risk, shall we say. And I think that is the result of that change of ownership.
I agree. And that risk piece is quite key because there seems to be a complete fear of failure now. How do we change this dynamic?
Well, that comes to what I term the heart of what I term great leadership and great management practice in companies. One of the key roles of leaders is to obviously set the direction of the company, inspire people around them, etc. But you want to encourage people to take, I won't necessarily say risks, but come up with ideas, find solutions, think for themselves, and have the security to try it out. And yes, it may fail, but you can correct that quickly, but they've got to have the security to feel that they're going to be backed if they take an opportunity and take a chance, and it might not work out. Because I can tell you, as a young manager, when you're working through, if you do make a mistake like that, those are the lessons you learn, absolutely. You need to be able to make mistakes and learn by the mistakes, and not be afraid to take a decision and do anything. The last thing you want is fear of taking action and just waiting to be told by a mythical head office or someone else. You want people to be entrepreneurial in their spirit within guidelines and not be afraid that they're going to be persecuted for thinking for themselves.
I agree. And part of that is also about how we train and develop people.
Well, and I think that is fundamental. And I think what we are going through at the moment perhaps gives us a time to reevaluate how we have been handling this over the last 5, 10, 15 years. It's almost like, we've got to pause in time to actually think, have we been doing it in the best way? Are there some lessons we can learn? And I'd like to think that we should be reevaluating the whole process of how we are attracting people to the sector, to our companies, how we are helping them, how we are promoting them, how they are gaining the necessary skills, reevaluate the whole process, because quite frankly, we have to do better than we're doing at the moment, and particularly as we are entering into, shall we say, a new world of new challenges.
It's always an interesting debate I've always had is about Kenley. Obviously, with Gardner Merchants, Kenley was very much the symbol of Gardner Merchant, wasn't it?
It was, and I mean, that was a very simple idea that in contract food service, we were trying to sell to clients and potential clients that we could actually manage their services better, they could do it themselves. And trying to demonstrate, as it were, something like service was very difficult in a theoretical way. But as soon as we had a practical training center like Kenley, where we brought all our managers, the whole 6,000 of the management team through Kenley, one is you were able to give them a common experience to impress on them what were the values of the company. But more importantly, you were able to bring clients and potential clients to Kenley to actually demonstrate what it was you were actually providing them as a service. And it was that physical demonstration of this is what we're about, which is what was key, as it were. So the two worked hand in hand. You demonstrated to clients the service you were providing, and you actually gave all your management a common approach of this is what we stand for, these are the standards we want, this is how we expect you to behave, etc., etc. So you actually could develop a core culture amongst your management, which they believed in. And it's the fact that they believed in it was the most important thing.
But actually, it always surprises me no one has ever tried to do something similar.
Well, I think what happened was, of course, investment in Kenley was a relatively expensive item, but in those days, our owners, Trust House 40, and then ourselves, we were happy to accept that growing the company by an organic 5% per annum was a very good return, because we didn't have much financial capital involved. We only had people capital involved. Now, when ownership changed to capital venture companies and others, it became the norm that a 5% organic growth was deemed to be inadequate, and companies started recording and financiers were asking for double-digit growth. Now, therefore, it became financially not viable to operate a place like Kenley, because they were just looking for bottom line growth, not reinvesting in the business. And it was this balance between investment in the business and what is a sensible growth rate in the business clashed. And I say to anyone, and one of the criticisms I have with capital venture companies is that whether it's in the hotel sector, restaurant sector, or contract food service business, capital venture and bankers have taken too much out of the business and not reinvested enough. We're not like Amazon or Google or an IT company where you can perhaps get 10, 15, 20% return on capital and annual growth. Hospitality is essentially a so steady, progressive business. It's about getting more customers to come and buy your services at the appropriate price and keep returning with a relatively fixed state capacity. So a 5% organic growth year on year on year on year, in my mind, is a very good rate of growth, and you can't get double-digit growth. And that was the clash. When people started demanding double-digit growth, they couldn't afford to invest in Kenley. You then saw cutbacks in training across companies, whole range of cutbacks to just polish the bottom line.
I understand all that. So what do you hope comes out of this period of time?
Well, what I would like to do, Chris, to have this, what I term pause period, let's go back to the core issues and try and reevaluate what we should be doing. The most important thing is, if we want to have great leaders of the future, we've got to go back to ensuring that we have the brightest and the best joining our sector. We want, people to see hospitality as a great opportunity for the future, and you want the brightest and the best to join you in the first place. That's through the colleges and the companies. So first of all, you want the brightest and the best. Then you want to ensure that the education they get in the colleges is appropriate. And to my mind, that means, yes, all the theory that they need for bright people, but also joined by practical application with perhaps a year working industry as part of their degree course. And even when they then leave college, they join companies where they continue to go on training and development courses. So it's important you get the brightest and the best to start with. They have the appropriate education at college, and they continue that education when they join companies. And maybe some of the courses have to be modified now, because obviously social media is so much an important sector of modern life. That's got to be stepped up in the colleges, how they work with that, how they work with multicultural workforces. Communications is more vital than ever. A whole range of things. Maybe some of the courses need moderating and updating to recognize those challenges. But above all, companies have got to recognize that when they take on these young people, they've got to continue to develop them and give them the opportunity, because if they're bright enough and they've had the right education, they will learn extremely quickly and can take on responsibility at a very young age. We don't have to wait till they're 40 before we give them a significant job. They can be doing that in their mid-20s, quite frankly.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's the key piece. How do we enable young talent? Because we've made life harder for young people now.
Well, I think we're going to see two things as a result of the future. I am sure when things start to improve, perhaps next year, we are going to see more small entrepreneurial businesses, small startups, more innovation, etc. I'm sure that will happen, and that's almost a natural process. But what I think, from my experience, we've got to focus on is getting the brightest and best of those young people into some of the bigger companies, because, they do make such a, whilst possibly 80% of all business enterprises in hospitality are still small businesses, when it comes to volume, the 20% big companies account for an enormous amount of the volume. And jobs, and that's where we need to get the brightest and best talent and get them given opportunity at an early age.
Yeah, no, I agree. Now, obviously, going back to the education piece, I mean, obviously, there's been quite a debate whether the education sector at the moment is fit for purpose in hospitality. So
I have to say, I think the biggest mistake I've seen in the last 5-10 years is the disappearance of the practical element of courses for hospitality management. There is nothing more important than having this balance between the theoretical and the practical. And if you don't get that input when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you never get the opportunity again, shall we say. So for those young people who aspire to senior levels, you really need that practical input there. So one, you do actually fully understand what hospitality is, but you also understand what you should expect from a receptionist, a waiter, a head waiter, someone working in the kitchen. How can you ultimately go and lead them and direct them if you don't understand what their tasks are and what they should be able to deliver? So that is why it's absolutely critical having that balance between the two.
I agree. Do you think we sell the industry well enough, though? I mean, this has been an old hobby horse, isn't it?
Well, it was interesting. I was having a thought this morning that if I had one course that I could set up urgently for the current set of business leaders, it would be a course for our senior business leaders in hospitality at the moment to go away for a week or 10 days course on understanding how the British political system works, how it works at national level and local level, how you can work with politicians to influence them on behalf of hospitality. And I think there's been a major problem there for the last few years that in the main, our business leaders don't understand how politics works in this country and how you influence them, how you work with them, and what politicians can do, but above all, what politicians can't do and what it's down for you to do. Just moaning at government that something hasn't worked sometimes is perhaps down to the industry, not politicians. And they, ranting from the sidelines doesn't achieve anything. One has to find ways of working with government, helping them find solutions for the problems, and then getting them implemented. That's how we make progress. And I think we've sadly lacked that in the last few years because our business leaders in the main do not understand how British politics work.
For those who don't remember, it's worth just noting that you were a government advisor for 2 years. Was it 2 years, 3 years?
Well, I suppose that's coloured my experience. I mean, I was very fortunate working at DCMS with Chris Smith and his team before I went to the BHA. And that gave me a real understanding of how government works from the inside, what it can do and what it can't do, and how you best work with them to find solutions to what your problems are. And I tell you, if you find that right relationship, you can achieve an awful lot. Good examples were during foot and mouth episode, where I think we worked very closely with government. The Olympic bid, we worked very closely with government. Post-terrorism issues, we work very closely with government, and a lot of the work programs for young people with Gordon Brown, working very closely with government. I think we started to go wrong when we adopted an attitude when some people wanted to reduce VAT, and we started haranguing government from the sidelines rather than working with them to find solutions to what the difficulties were that we had. And that is the key. Government doesn't really understand specialist sectors, but they need your help in finding solutions to the problems that you have. You know, collectively, the industry has an enormous amount of experience, and if you can bring that collective experience together, we can find solutions to the problems and then work with government to get them implemented. You can't expect politicians and even civil servants who move from job to job, department to department, to understand how our sector works in detail.
So are you pro this idea of a hospitality minister that Petition's been trying to do, or you think that's just...
I have to say I'm not, but I will be careful here. But my reasoning is really based on experience. What matters in government is having a man round the cabinet table who fully understands the sector and supports it. I was lucky because I worked with Chris Smith and then Tessa Jowl and then a number of others who were great advocates for tourism. They sat round the cabinet table and they supported us. The mistake started to occur when it was allowed to be passed down to first a Minister of State with Richard Caburn, and then a parliamentary secretary, which is the most junior member, because in government terms, you know, if you had a problem with the Home Office and a parliamentary secretary responsible for tourism was handling it, they could only have a meeting with their equivalent in the Home Office. You actually need someone at cabinet level. So what is important is, one, we have a mechanism where we can keep the current cabinet minister who holds the responsibility, and for me it can be DCMS or it can be BIS. Whoever holds the responsibility, we need a very close relationship with the cabinet minister so that they, as it were, bang the table at cabinet level to understand our issues. If we have a tourism minister, all the tourism minister does, and it's not a bad thing, is they're the one who can perhaps go around the country and raise the flag for tourism, visit tourism sites, raise morale, make people feel that at least they're being listened to. But in terms of real power and action, it's the cabinet minister that matters.
I understand that. I mean, you've worked with some great leaders over the years, both in the political arena and obviously in the business arena. Who stands out for you? Who's made a real difference? Well,
it's interesting you raise that, because I've always taken the view that, you know, whilst I was fortunate to have what I term probably a good education in terms of going to Surrey University and being what I term one of the first year's graduates for hospitality, and then great training with Trust House 40 and Gardner Merchant, I always felt that the best experiences I had was watching and working alongside what I term great leaders. whether it was Lord Forte himself, who I can tell you was an exceptional leader, right through to Gary Hawkes, who I was very fortunate to work with for 20 years. And you actually watch and observe and learn from them. And that is one of the worries I have at the moment, is that I think, it is the best way to learn leadership skills is by close observation of people in practice. And that, of course, is what we're missing at the moment. And it's going to be a real issue at the moment, that is what young people are missing out on, seeing other leaders working in practice.
I mean, you won't get, Lord Forte built an amazing business over a 30, 40-year period. You just won't see that again, will you?
You say that. I mean, I can perhaps sort of point to someone like Pierre Bellon from Sodexo, who only started the business in 1966 with 500 francs, and now the business is worth 45 billion, and the family still own 43%. I still think you will see examples into the future of individuals coming to the fore and creating large companies. Whether they will be as large and dominant is another matter. I mean, particularly in the hotel sector, for example, I think people won't be able to, what I term, have the finance to be able to end up with a hotel empire of 880 hotels, for example. Yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
But you will still see individuals who do rise to the fore, because hospitality is a dynamic business and does have opportunities all the time and will so into the future. One can look at the position of Alistair Storey. Alistair Storey, with his business, has only been in the business 20 years it's been founded. And, that is a fairly substantial success story in contract food service.
Yeah, very much so. Very much
so. So, there will be great opportunities for the future for people to join this sector and, quite frankly, be successful and make money. Whether it will be the scale of, as you say, Pierre Bellon or Lord Forte is another matter. But I can tell you, those two people were exceptional. I saw them both at close quarters, and they had this ability to inspire teams around them. And that was a very critical issue of leadership and management then, and I think it is a critical issue about leadership and management today. It's about picking the right people. It's about inspiring the team and loyalty amongst the team. And if nothing else, Gary Hawkes and the Gardner Merchant experience above all proved that, where he selected a team of people around him who were together for the best part of 15 years, and they all had their different skills, but effectively made a great team, and his job was to inspire and lead them.
We were talking before we came on about how right across Europe there's a great unrest beginning to emerge. And this ties in, because actually that ties into, there's a lack of trust in leadership generally, isn't there now?
Yes, I think you're right, Chris, but maybe the leaders of the last few years, whether they be business leaders or political leaders, have taken their eye off the ball about what leadership is all about. And it is about connecting with people and winning hearts and minds of people. If you can't win the hearts and minds of people, you can't achieve anything. Sending out an email to someone or sending out an instruction doesn't achieve anything other than passing on information. It's about how you win hearts and minds. And I think maybe the last few years, leaders in many sectors and in public life have taken their eye off that ball about what leadership actually is. And if you look in political terms, and I'm not going to make political judgments here, whether it's Thatcher or Blair as two examples, they had a great ability to connect with people and win the hearts and minds of a sufficient number of people to support them. I think many subsequent leaders we've had in politics haven't had that ability to connect and win hearts and minds. And if I then go to business leaders, nothing is more important in your business life, running your company, is than winning the hearts and minds of your staff and your teams around you, rather than just telling them.
And this goes back to the bit about having strong values back in business, isn't it? Because that's the bit that argues.
Well, you've got to have strong values, but you've actually got to put them into practice. Just because you have a nice mission statement, which has been prepared for you by Bain & Co. or McKinsey or something, and is nicely published, doesn't do the job. You've got to have... Yes, you need mission statements, etc., but you've actually got to live the mission statement and demonstrate it and live it. And people make judgments about people. People judge their immediate boss. They judge their boss's boss. Are they actually living the mission statement? Do they know the difference between right and wrong? Are they doing the right thing? Are they treating people fairly? Are they giving opportunity for all? All these sort of things. You've actually got to practice the mission statement, live the mission statement, and it's got to be seen to happen. Then people will trust you more, rather than, I think, too much time has been spent on polishing bits of paper and marketing materials, rather than actually living what it says.
I mean, we face now probably the biggest challenge in leadership in trying to re-engage people back to the workplace once this is all over.
Well, that comes to the heart of the challenge we have now and the challenge for the future. You know, people should have been spending the last 6 months keeping engaged with all their staff wherever possible, being honest with them, being open with them, communicating with them. Suggesting training programs for them while they're at home, taking them with them, building that ongoing trust so that people will go with them, will make the sacrifices in the short term, but they will come back to you and work with you harder than ever when we start to reopen the businesses, because I'd hate to think that whole workforces are totally dismantled and you have to start from scratch again. You do want to hold on to as many of your people in some form as you can. And that's done by talking to them, being in touch with them, sharing issues with them. And under current circumstances, doing it online or through Zoom or whatever takes an awful lot of time. And I think some are doing it much better than others, quite frankly. And thinking of ways, how can I keep this disparate team still motivated? Are they undergoing training at home? Are they learning new skills? How am I keeping them occupied and motivated, etc., etc.?
No, it's going to be an interesting one, isn't it? And do you think, there's obviously impacts on cities as well, do you think that it will come back to normal, or do you think it will change life forever?
I think one has to accept the reality that parts will come back to normality. I think if I'm looking at the hotel sector, for example, ultimately tourism will return because people like to travel. It may not be for 1, 2, or 3 years, but that sector of the business will return, and tourism and travel is absolutely critical, particularly to city centre business. Okay? Mm-hmm. So hotels, and they may change their mix. I think the business side of business travel will change, but I'm saying I think the experience travel will return ultimately. The restaurant business, I know that people like to go out to eat and socialize. So again, at some time in the future, that business will return, although it may well be more regionally and locally focused rather than city centre focused. Because I think there will be a change in working patterns, whilst, and I think the Andy Haldane report from the Bank of England yesterday, the day before, pointing out, the disadvantages of everyone working from home, there will be far more people return to the office at some time in the future. Not everyone will return to the office, and many companies will find that they can make substantial savings by having a mix of people working from home and people coming into the office perhaps 2 or 3 days a week. And in the same way that you're seeing, even university lecturers in the future, some turning up to lecture halls for some lectures and other lectures being done online. I think they call it blended education. I think we're going to see blended workforces in the future. So city centres will not be as busy from workforces as they were in the past, but there will be a return. So that is going to have an impact, particularly on the contract food service business.
That's going to be the real challenge, isn't it? I mean, air travel is going to take, in theory, will return to 2025, I think the latest report is.
Well, exactly. I'm saying 2 to 3 years, yeah.
And actually, contract will take another 5 years as well to rebuild back where it was.
Well, it will be a different form of contract food service. I suspect there'll be a much more delivered food element, a simplified food element, and the elaborate feeding that we saw in the past will not be around for the time being, quite frankly, for the foreseeable future. So people will have to find innovative ways of delivering food to customers, more simplified food on site, etc., etc. If you've only got people coming into work 2 days a week or even 3 days a week and a much smaller workforce, do you need a full service canteen or restaurant, or can you just have a delivered food service for those people that you need it, or even do you need the restaurant at all, and can people go outside to find that break, that food? So it's going to have a major impact on contract food service business in central city sites, particularly in London.
Moving on to another subject, one of the things you did incredibly successfully with BHA was really get the UK, all the hospitality business across the UK getting work well together, didn't you? And you laid the ground.
I did, and I spent a lot of time working at it. I mean, I'm one of the things I was very proud of achieving was setting up the Tourism Alliance for Tourism in England and helping with the Tourism Alliance in Wales and Scotland, recognising that we wanted one collective body representing the sector and not just ploughing your own furrow, as it were. And the same within hospitality. I worked extremely hard to try and bringing the restaurant sector involved, in those days, fortunately, we had motorway services, airport services, all hospitality strands under one umbrella. And I think that is helpful when you're talking to government, because if you give government one cohesive message, they listen to you. If they start getting half a dozen different messages from the sector, they either ignore them all or they play one view off against another and do nothing. So by having one cohesive voice, one cohesive message, you have a better chance on your interface with government of getting them to understand what your issues are.
I suppose my question I was getting towards, agreeing all that, was actually, are you concerned by how the UK seems to be splitting up a bit? That's a leadership piece.
It is the challenge, but I mean, quite frankly, once devolution was introduced in
98?
By Blair, the genie was out of the bottle, and Scotland was obviously going to start to go its own way. Wales the same, and Northern Ireland. I worked extremely hard whilst recognising the local parliaments, but also to try and keep what I term the British Hospitality Association as a common entity so that we could feed into those various bodies. But I think I'm afraid it's the reality that once you introduce devolution, you are going to get different approaches. What I hope is that within England, we don't then start getting significant different approaches within England, so that you end up having different, as it were, legislation affecting the sector, London to Manchester, Leeds to whatever, because that will make it extremely difficult for the sector. I can understand under current lockdown conditions, while we need to have different arrangements to try and cope with COVID-19, but I think down the track, the last thing we want is what I term devolve government to the regions, so that you have different rules and regulations for the sector, even across the regions of England. I think that would be a major challenge for our sector.
Let's return finally back to the young people again, because they're, I think, the biggest concern at this moment in time. I think the industry, we're talking about anything between 300 and 400,000 losing their jobs during the last 7 months. The real challenge is to give these people hope, isn't it?
Well, exactly, and I think that's where what I term some public messaging by the leaders of the sector needs to start now. Is, quite frankly, we've got to give these people some hope for the future, that this is a great sector, a great industry to work in with great opportunity, and that will come back, and that we've got to try and get that message over that there is hope for the future. Stick with it. If we can encourage training, any amount of training to improve their skills so that they're ready for work when the work is available, that is what the role is at the moment, is keep their spirits alive, keep their hopes alive, and show them and demonstrate what the opportunities will be in the future. Because whilst other industries might disappear altogether, whatever happens during COVID, there will come a time when we either find a vaccine or it's under control. And I can tell you, hospitality will survive and flourish. And I'm not sure you can say that about every industry and every sector, but I can guarantee you that hospitality will survive, will come back, and will be strong into the future. So if we can get young people to understand that, it may be difficult at the moment, but if they get the skills, get any training they can, keep connected to the sector, when the jobs start to return, there will be the opportunities, and then it's up to the business leaders who are in charge then to give those young people the opportunities at that time.
Yeah. Now, I think you're a great advocate that actually it's important to bring those people, those top leaders together to start doing this messaging.
Yes.
This for a number of months, haven't you? And
I have indeed.
And that's the bit's missing, sorry.
Say, Chris, I didn't hear that.
So that's the bit's been missing, isn't it, at the moment?
It is. And I think, this isn't about your individual company. This is about a sector coming together, working together. And I would like to see leaders of the major hotel groups, the restaurant groups, the contract caterers, the lead independents, coming together collectively with a common message, broadcasting it to the wider world and also their workforces, this core message. Yes, it's tough at the moment, but this is a great industry. There is a future for it. We recognize how important you are, and we will give you opportunity as soon as we can.
Well, on that note, I think that's the best way to leave it. Can I just thank you for your time today?
Okay, good to speak to you, Chris, and take care.
And you, take care. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.